The snow fell in lazy flakes on the quiet streets of Cleveland, Ohio, covering the garden of my modest home with a pristine white blanket. It was a few days before Christmas, and the lights I had so carefully hung in the living room window blinked at a soft pace, a promise of celebration that, inside, rang hollow. Every ornament on the tree, every garland on the wall, was a silent witness to decades of Christmases past, of a house that once vibrated with laughter and now echoed only with my loneliness and the ticking of an old grandfather clock. The contrast was an open wound, a festive and welcoming scene that, instead of warming, only amplified the chill I felt in my soul. I saw myself reflected in the dark glass of the window, a 72-year-old woman whose wrinkles were not just marks of time, but maps of recent worries and distant smiles. My shoulders, slightly stooped, betrayed the invisible weight I had been carrying for years. As a retired primary school teacher, I lived on a modest pension and savings I had disciplinedly gathered my entire life, money that was supposed to guarantee me a peaceful old age, but had become the fragile link connecting me to my only son, Mark. At that moment, I was on the phone with him, my hand gripping the receiver with unnecessary force. My voice was a fragile thread of hope, trying to weave a bridge over the abyss of indifference he had built between us. I recounted, with an enthusiasm I barely felt, the gifts I had already bought for my grandchildren, how I imagined the joy on their little faces as they opened them on Christmas morning. Every word was a veiled plea for an invitation I knew might not come, but that my mother's heart refused to stop hoping for. "I've already wrapped everything, Mark. I bought that train set Timmy wanted so much and a beautiful doll for Lily. I can't wait to see their faces," I said. And the pause that followed from the other end of the line was colder than the snow outside. His silence was an omen, a harbinger of the storm that was about to break over my head. I could almost hear him breathing, impatient on the other side, as if my display of affection were a nuisance, an interruption to his busy and important life. Then, his voice cut through the air, sharp and devoid of any warmth. "Mom, actually, we weren't expecting you this year." Each word was a direct blow to my chest, stealing my breath. "Sarah's whole family is coming over, and the house will be packed. It's going to be chaotic, you know. It's better if you don't come." The excuse was so flimsy, so transparent in its cruelty, that it hurt more than if he had simply shouted that he didn't want me around. He didn't see me as family, but as an inconvenience. As if the humiliation weren't enough, after a cold pause that seemed to last an eternity, he added the phrase that would seal my fate that night. "Why don't you just mail the presents?" The question wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. I was no longer a grandmother, a mother. I had been demoted to a mere provider of packages, a seasonal delivery service, devoid of presence, of affection, of importance. My role in their lives was clear. I was the ATM and, now, Santa Claus from a distance. Those words broke something inside me. A dam of years of sacrifices, of monthly checks to help pay the mortgage on his luxurious house, of excuses I made to myself to justify his absence, finally gave way. I was a fool who believed that money could buy my place in my son's life, that my sacrifices would one day be recognized as acts of love and not as an obligation he felt entitled to demand. In silence, with a hand shaking in a way I couldn't control, I hung up the phone. There was no goodbye, not another word. Just the final click of the receiver in its cradle, a definitive sound that ended not just a call, but an era of illusions. I stood there staring at the phone as if it were a venomous animal that had just bitten me, injecting a poison of devaluation and rejection straight into my heart. Outside, the Christmas bells from the neighbor's house began to play a cheerful melody, a festive song that, to my ears, sounded like the cruelest of mockeries. Each crystalline note seemed to laugh at my pain, at my crushing loneliness in a time that should be of togetherness and love. The sound that once brought me a sense of comfort and nostalgia was now just a sharp and painful reminder of what I had lost, of what, in fact, I never had. I sat down heavily in my worn-out armchair, the same one where I had rocked Mark when he was a baby, where I helped him with his homework, where I dreamed of the man he would become. The lights on the Christmas tree blinked, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Every ornament, every family photo on the shelves, seemed to stare at me with accusation. The house, which had always been my refuge, my sanctuary, suddenly became a prison of painful memories and an unbearably empty present. The penny finally dropped, not as a gentle revelation, but as an avalanche of concrete. The phone call was not an isolated incident. It was the brutal confirmation of a pattern I had refused to see for years. I was not a mother being loved. I was a resource being exploited. My love, my time, and especially my money, were commodities he used to sustain a lifestyle he couldn't afford, offering me crumbs of attention and controlled access to my own grandchildren in return. The humiliation was a bitter taste in my mouth, to be dismissed so coldly, so calculatingly, after having sacrificed my financial security, my peace of mind for him. The pain was deep, a physical ache that radiated from my chest to every inch of my body. That night, under the lonely glow of the Christmas lights, I realized that the house of cards that was my relationship with my son had collapsed, and I was buried under the rubble. The night was long, bathed in silent tears I hadn't shed in years. I cried for the mother I tried to be, for the son I lost somewhere along the way, and for the grandmother I was denied being. I cried for my own blindness, for my complicity in my own devaluation. But as dawn approached, bringing with it the first pale light of a new day, the sadness began to give way to something different, a spark of anger, of indignation, and finally, a quiet, firm resolution. At dawn, the pale light filtering through the kitchen window found me sitting at the table, an untouched cup of tea before me. The torrent of tears from the night before had ceased, leaving behind a deep exhaustion, but also a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The suffering had washed my soul, and in place of blind pain, there was now a cold, unshakable resolve. The chrysalis of my denial had ruptured during the night. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I could no longer continue being the caterpillar I had been. My gaze fell upon the calendar hanging on the wall, a gift from a former student. There, circled in red pen, was the reminder that haunted the beginning of each month. Pay Mark's mortgage. That small note was the tangible symbol of my servitude, the representation of how my love and financial security had been converted into bricks and mortar for a life I was not a part of. It was the chain that bound me, and I knew, in that instant, that I needed the key to set myself free. With a slow, almost ceremonial movement, I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. I opened my old laptop, the hum of the machine breaking the silence of the house. My age-wrinkled fingers trembled slightly as I typed the password for the online bank, but my face was impassive, a mask of determination. Each click was a step into unknown and frightening territory, a path back to myself. The bank page loaded, displaying the modest balance I struggled to maintain. I navigated to the automatic payments section, a feature Mark had taught me to use, ironically, to facilitate the monthly transfer to him. There it was, recurring payment of $1,200 to Cleveland Mortgage Corp. I looked at the small red button next to the description, which read, Cancel. It was so simple, a single click to undo years of a silent, destructive agreement. The moment my finger hovered over the mouse, a wave of guilt hit me with the force of a punch. A voice, which sounded frighteningly like my own mother's, echoed in my head. Am I being a terrible mother? A real mother sacrifices without question. It was the conditioning of a lifetime, the social programming that maternal love is synonymous with self-annihilation, a blank check signed with one's own soul. Immediately after the guilt came fear, cold and paralyzing. What if he loses the house? Where will my grandchildren live? What if he never lets me see them again? The emotional blackmail he had used for so long was deeply rooted in me. The idea of being completely banished from the boys' lives, the only light in my old age, was a terror that threatened to make me back down, to make me close the laptop and pretend the previous night never happened. My mind then transported me to 5 years ago, to the kitchen of the small house where Mark lived before. I remember him and Sarah spreading blueprints of luxurious houses on the table. "It's for your grandchildren, Mom," Mark said, with contagious enthusiasm. "So they can have a yard to play in, a decent room." The manipulation was masterful. How could I say no to my grandchildren's future? That afternoon, I agreed to use almost half of my life savings to make the down payment on their dream home. From that day on, the dynamic was set. Every request for money came wrapped in the children's well-being. "Mom, the heater broke, and the boys will be cold. Swimming lessons are expensive, but it's important for their development." And I, desperately wanting to believe I was investing in their happiness, gave in. After each transfer, I would receive a photo of the smiling grandchildren, a calculated reward that made me feel, for a brief moment, that I was part of it, a loved and needed mother and grandmother. I remembered the last Christmas I spent with them. I sat in a corner on the expensive sofa, a sofa I helped buy, feeling more like a distant guest than the matriarch of the family. Conversations flowed around me, full of inside jokes and references I didn't understand. I was a tolerated presence, a ghost at their feast, and the loneliness I felt that day, surrounded by my own family, was deeper than any loneliness I had ever felt alone in my house. These memories, instead of weakening me, fueled my resolve. The pain of the previous night's phone call was not about a single lost Christmas. It was the last straw that broke the camel's back. My love had been turned into a service contract, and I was the only one fulfilling the clauses. My heart and my bank account were resources to be exploited, and I was exhausted from paying the price. I took a deep breath, an exhale that seemed to carry away all my hesitation. With a firm, definitive click, I pressed the button. The page refreshed, and a small green message appeared. "Recurring payment successfully canceled." Those words, so simple and bureaucratic, seemed to echo through the house. They were, at the same time, terrifying in their finality and glorious in their promise of freedom. A strange calm settled over me. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was the quiet that follows a great storm. A sense of lightness, as if the invisible weight I had carried on my shoulders for years had finally been lifted. I had reclaimed a small part of myself, a piece I didn't even know I had lost until that moment. I felt like a nation declaring its independence. The following days were of absolute silence. The phone, which was once my source of anxiety and hope, remained mute. But the silence was different now. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. For the first time in a long time, I did things for myself. I baked a batch of gingerbread cookies and ate as many as I wanted without worrying about saving them for a visit that would never happen. I put on my old vinyl records, letting Nat King Cole's music fill the house. Then, the storm arrived. 4 days later, the phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through my newfound peace. My heart raced. It was Mark. I answered with a trembling hand, but his voice didn't have the pleading or sad tone that a foolish part of me might have expected. It was pure rage, distorted and loud. "What did you do?" he yelled, without even a hello. He screamed that the bank had notified him about the missed mortgage payment, that his credit could be ruined. The accusations came in a torrent. I was cruel, vengeful, selfish. "Are you trying to ruin our Christmas? Is that it? You want your grandkids to be homeless because of your drama?" Every word was designed to hurt me, to make me feel guilty and small, to force me back into my box. I was shaken, but I did not yield. The Eleanor of a week ago would have apologized profusely, would have rushed to the bank to fix her mistake. But something had changed. "Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly calm amidst his fury, "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." The firmness in my own words surprised me and, for an instant, silenced him. But it was only for an instant. He then resorted to his most powerful weapon, gaslighting. "Can't anymore? After everything I've done for you? After I gave you grandchildren, this is how you thank me? Have you gone crazy, Mom?" He twisted reality, painting me as the aggressor, the ungrateful one, the unbalanced one. He was trying to make me doubt my own sanity, a tactic that had worked countless times in the past. A few hours later, the phone rang again. This time, it was Sarah. Her approach was more subtle, but equally venomous. Her voice was sweet and falsely concerned. "Eleanor, dear, I'm sure there's been a mistake. Mark is so stressed with work, and this mess with the bank. I'm sure you didn't mean to cause this trouble. Could you please fix this for us?" When I held my ground, calmly stating that the decision was final, Sarah's tone changed instantly. The sweetness evaporated, giving way to a cutting coldness. "Well, if that's how you want it," she said, with a calculated pause, "I don't think it will be good for the boys to see their grandmother acting so selfishly. Children are impressionable, you know." The threat was clear, a veiled knife pointed at my most vulnerable spot, my love for my grandchildren. I hung up the phone, and finally, the tears returned. But they were different tears. They were not of self-pity or shame. They were tears of grief. Grief for the family I dreamed of having and that never existed. Grief for the son I loved, but who had become a stranger. I cried for the pain of the rupture, which was real and deep, but also for the realization that I was finally mourning an illusion. Paradoxically, Mark's furious attacks and Sarah's cold manipulation served to strengthen my decision. Their reaction was the definitive proof that I was right. At no point did they ask how I was. At no point did they care about my feelings. Their concern was not for me, but for the money tap that had been turned off. They didn't miss the mother or the grandmother. They missed the sponsor. Later that night, I sat at the desk again and looked at my bank statement. There was the amount, $200. Money that was now mine. Money that represented freedom. My gaze wandered to a drawer and I pulled out a yellowed travel brochure I had kept for years, with pictures of the Pacific coast. An old dream, always postponed. And for the first time, a small, hopeful idea began to form. A light at the end of the tunnel of my immediate pain. The journey would be difficult, but for the first time, the destination was my own. The knock on the door came days later, not a friendly knock from a neighbor, but a series of sharp, urgent, and angry raps that echoed through the silent house. My heart sank. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who was on the other side. The peace I had so carefully cultivated over the last few days dissolved like smoke, replaced by a cold apprehension. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked to face the storm I knew was coming my way. When I opened the door, I was met by Mark, but it was not the polished, superficially successful Marquand was used to seeing. He looked disheveled, his hair unkempt, his face tense and pale under the dim porch light. The snow fell softly on his shoulders, but his eyes burned with a mixture of panic and fury. He looked like a cornered man, a wild animal about to attack, and I realized the crisis he was facing was very real. Before I could say a word, he pushed past me, invading my living room uninvited. His frantic, angry energy filled the small space, contaminating the calm air. He stopped in the middle of the room, his presence an aggressive violation of the sanctuary I had begun to rebuild for myself. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of desperation was a nauseating combination that assaulted my senses. He stood there, a dark and imposing figure between my lonely Christmas tree, with its handmade ornaments, and the fireplace, where the dusty pictures of him as a child rested. The images of a smiling, innocent boy seemed to mock the bitter, desperate man he had become. The past and present collided in that small space, and I felt the weight of all the lost hopes and broken promises. He turned to me, his face a mask of contempt. "You are going to reactivate that payment. Now." His voice was low, controlled, but laden with a threat that made me shiver. It was not a request, not a plea. It was an order, given with the arrogance of someone who still believed he had absolute power over me, who saw me not as his mother, but as an insubordinate employee. A strength I didn't know I possessed rose from the depths of my soul. I crossed my arms over my chest, a small gesture of defiance, and met his gaze without flinching. No, Mark, I said, my voice sounding firmer than I felt. I will not. The word no, so rarely used with him, hung in the air between us, potent and irrevocable. It was the final declaration of my independence. The refusal made him explode. The facade of control crumbled, and fury took over. How could you do this to me? He yelled, the sound of his voice filling every corner of my small house. He began to pace back and forth, gesturing wildly. He accused me of being cruel, of being jealous of his life, of wanting to see him fail. The words were projectiles, ugly and venomous, each one carefully chosen to break me. When the yelling didn't have the desired effect, he changed tactics. The anger dissipated, replaced by a performative desperation. His voice broke. His shoulders slumped. Mom, please, he begged, his eyes suddenly moist. We're on the edge. The bank is going to take the house. Please don't do this to your grandchildren. I could lose everything. He was trying to wrap me in guilt, to make me solely responsible for the ruin he himself had built. Then, he played his last card, the final trump of emotional blackmail, the phrase he saved for moments of greatest need. He approached, his face contorted in an expression of an outraged victim. After all I've done for you, you treat me like this? The question was so absurd, so detached from the reality of our lives, that for a moment I was breathless, shocked by the audacity of that distortion. Hearing those words was the turning point. Something inside me, a rope that had been stretched to its limit for years, finally snapped. The fog of guilt and obligation that had always clouded my judgment dissipated, revealing the truth with blinding clarity. All the pain, all the sacrifice, all the loneliness, it all crystallized in that single moment of absolute lucidity. The victim here was not him. I faced him, no longer with fear or hesitation, but with an icy calm. My voice, when I spoke, was thick with the emotion of decades, but it was unshakably firm. All you've done for me, Mark? I repeated, the sound of my own voice giving me strength. I gave you life. I gave you everything I had. I continued, each word coming out with a weight and a truth he could no longer ignore. I gave you my money, all my time, all my heart. I gave up my own dreams so you could build yours on top of my savings. I watched in silence as you turned me into an ATM. But a family is not a business, Mark. Love is not a transaction. I took a deep breath, preparing for the final blow, the words that would seal the end of our old dynamic forever. Love has no price, but my dignity does. That house, I said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of his luxurious life, is your responsibility, your wife, and your children are your responsibility. It's time for you to stop hiding behind my skirt and learn to be the man that I, foolishly, always believed you could be. Mark was completely speechless. The shock on his face was total, as if I had slapped him. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. Not the docile, submissive mother, but a woman with boundaries, with self-respect. He saw in my eyes that his power over me had evaporated. The puppet strings had been cut, and he was alone on the stage. There was nothing left to say, as his script of manipulation had become useless. He turned abruptly, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief. Without another word, he marched to the door and left, slamming it with a force that made the pictures on the wall tremble. The sound of the slam echoed through the house, a violent and definitive full stop. The pain of the rupture was real, a deep cut in my heart, but beneath the pain, an overwhelming wave of freedom washed over me. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I was free. The silence that followed Mark's departure was different from all the others. It was not the silence of loneliness or expectation, but the deep, resonant silence that settles after a devastating storm. I collapsed into my armchair, not to cry, but to breathe. Each breath felt like the first I had taken as a free woman. It was the silence of a battlefield after the war had been won, where the devastation was visible, but the promise of peace finally seemed real. The next morning, I woke to the first rays of sunlight, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. I felt a purpose. I looked at my bank account on the laptop, at that $100 or $200 amount that remained there, untouched. It wasn't just money. It was the materialization of my freedom, a seed capital for a new life. It was a ticket to a destination I would choose for myself, a passport out of the emotional prison I had helped build. I picked up the phone, the same device that once brought me so much pain, and felt a wave of power. My hands were steady. I dialed the number of the local community center, a place I had driven past for years but never dared to enter. My voice, as I asked about classes and activities, sounded clear and confident. I was no longer asking for permission to live. I was making plans. I signed up for a watercolor painting class, a secret desire I had harbored since my youth, before marriage, children, the responsibilities that swallowed me whole. It was a dream buried under almost 50 years of motherly duties and sacrifices. That small act of filling out the registration form was monumental, a declaration that my desires mattered, that the woman I was before I was mom still existed and deserved to be rediscovered. In the first class, I felt a nervousness I hadn't experienced in a long time, but as I entered the room filled with light and the smell of paint, I realized something wonderful. There, I was not Mark's mom or the lonely grandmother. I was just Eleanor. People asked about me, about my interests. I met Maria, a retired librarian with a contagious smile and a sharp wit, and for the first time in decades, I made a friend. A real friend. My first brushstrokes were clumsy, the colors bled into each other, but the joy I felt was pure and childlike. The simple act of creating something, however imperfect, just for my own pleasure, was therapeutic. With every crooked landscape and blurred flower I painted, a part of my long dormant identity awakened. I was filling the blank pages of my life with new colors, literally. With the money I was now saving every month, the distant dream of seeing the Pacific Ocean began to take shape. It went from being a fantasy to a concrete plan. Maria and I would spend hours after art class, with maps and brochures spread across the table, planning a road trip along the California coast, having a future to look forward to. Something tangible and exciting on the horizon was the best medicine for the scars of the past. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, reality came knocking on Mark's door. The consequences of his choices, so long cushioned by my money, fell upon him with full force. Without my financial support, the house of cards he and Sarah had built on a foundation of debt and appearances began to crumble quickly and brutally. The life of luxury they flaunted was, as I suspected, a complete sham. They couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. The pressure from creditors became unbearable. The arguments between him and Sarah, once muffled by material comfort, became constant and venomous. They were forced to face the stark truth. They were living a lie they could no longer sustain. The fall was as swift as the rise, and there was no one to cushion the impact. The process of selling the luxurious house was a lesson in humility for them. They had to get rid of the expensive car, the designer, furniture, all the symbols of a status that never truly belonged to them. They moved into a small, simple apartment, the kind they used to look down upon with disdain. The material loss was immense, but it was the loss of pride that hit them the hardest. Stripped of his symbols of success, Mark was forced into a painful and necessary self-reflection. In the silence of his new, modest apartment, without distractions, he had to face the man he saw in the mirror. My last words to him echoed in his mind. Learn to be the man I always believed you could be. For the first time, perhaps, he began to understand what they meant. Back in my now vibrant home, I was packing for my great adventure. The atmosphere was transformed. My watercolors, now more confident and colorful, adorned the walls. The silence had been replaced by the music I loved, and the occasional sound of my own laughter on the phone with Maria. My new life philosophy was simple but powerful. Self-love is not selfishness. It is a necessity. And setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but the purest language of respect. The final scene of this chapter of my life could not have been more perfect. I, Eleanor Vance, at 73, stood on a cliff in Big Sur, the salty Pacific wind in my hair. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that no watercolor could capture. In my hands, a small sketchbook where I sketched the waves crashing on the rocks. My face, turned towards the sun, no longer showed pain or weariness, but a deep peace, a serene strength, and a contentment that came from within. I was whole again. I didn't have to destroy my son to save myself. I just had to free myself from him. And that liberation was not an act of revenge, but the beginning of my glorious and belated renaissance. 1 year later, the snow was falling again on Cleveland, just like before. But inside my house, everything was different. It was Christmas Eve, and the air wasn't heavy with silence, but vibrant with the sound of laughter, lively conversation, and the clinking of glasses. The Christmas tree lights no longer mocked my loneliness. They illuminated the smiling faces of my new friends, my new family. Maria was by my side, helping to serve dinner, while other friends from the painting class and the book club filled the living room with human warmth. I had transformed my house from a mausoleum of painful memories into a sanctuary of present joy. In the midst of the celebration, the doorbell rang, a soft, almost hesitant sound. I exchanged a calm look with Maria and went to answer. Opening the door, I saw Mark. He was alone, standing on the porch under the falling snow. He looked older, thinner, and there was a humility in his posture that I had never seen before. The arrogance and fury had disappeared, replaced by a tired but genuine quietness. In his hands, he held a single small gift, wrapped with a care I knew was not store-bought. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw the weight of the year that had passed. He didn't try to force his way in or start an argument. He just stood there vulnerable. "Mom," he began, his voice low and hoarse. "I know I have no right, but I had to come. I'm sorry for everything." The apology was simple, devoid of excuses or manipulations, and for that reason, it felt like the first true thing he had said to me in a decade. He looked past me, at the warm, happy scene in my living room, and a trace of sadness crossed his face before he looked back at me. "I just wanted to know if—" He hesitated, swallowing hard. "If I can come in and stay with my mom for a little while." The question was the key to everything. He was no longer demanding. He was asking. He was no longer referring to a property, but to a person, to his mom. He was, finally, acknowledging my terms. A genuine smile, free of pain and full of a deep peace, spread across my face. I looked at my son, the man who had to lose everything to begin to find himself, and I felt a pang of compassion, not pity. The healing was far from complete, but there, on that cold Christmas night, it could begin. I opened the door a little wider. "Merry Christmas, Mark," I said softly. "Come in. It's cold out there." The cycle was not just closed. A new, healthier one had a chance to begin.